Smart enough. Not. Why am I not like the others? He carried himself with a calm, polished confidence that seemed almost too carefully constructed as he entered one of the most scrutinized families in the world. The royal family was unraveling around him, yet somehow he managed to win a princess's heart in the middle of all of it. But his story is far from straightforward. Beneath that carefully maintained image lies a troubling past, a child left caught in the crossfire, and a pattern of behavior Eduardo has worked hard to keep out of sight. That pattern is now coming to light. And what it exposes about the man Beatrice chose to marry is, to say the least, deeply unsettling. The ex-fiancé and the son named Wolfie. Long before Princess Beatrice came into the picture, Eduardo was already trying to build a life with someone else, a woman named Dara Huang. She was no ordinary partner. Harvard-educated and internationally recognized, Dara had carved out a remarkable career in architecture and would eventually build her own design firm from the ground up. By every account, she was brilliant, driven, and fully committed to the future she and Eduardo were constructing together. They were engaged. They had plans. But somewhere beneath the surface of that life, things had already started to come apart. Something came along that should have pulled them closer together. Instead, it drove a deeper wedge between them. Dara became pregnant. Rather than strengthening the relationship, the pregnancy seemed to expose how fragile things already were. People close to the couple say tension had been quietly building for some time, tension that never showed on the outside. There were reports that they had gone weeks at a stretch without exchanging so much as a word with each other. Which means that Dara may have been carrying their child while the entire foundation of their relationship was silently crumbling beneath her feet. Dara understood exactly what it meant to bring a child into an unstable relationship. If things fell apart, she would be the one left holding everything together alone. So she held on. She pushed through. She tried. But then one night, the pressure finally broke through the surface. Like so many arguments, it started small, but something was said that crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In that moment, Dara stopped holding back. She told Eduardo that if he wanted to leave, he was free to go. She was finished fighting for something that already felt beyond repair. She would raise the child on her own, and one day that child would understand exactly who had chosen to stay and who had walked away. For the rest of that week, those who saw her described her eyes as swollen and red, carrying not just one night of pain but months of accumulated fear, stress, and exhaustion that had nowhere left to go. After that night, nothing between them was ever the same. And yet the outside world remained completely unaware. In 2016, Wolfie was born. Christopher Wolf Mapelli Motzi came into the world already surrounded by instability, even if no one was willing to say it openly. Then things became even stranger. Throughout 2017, Eduardo and Dara continued to appear together in public. Events, appearances, photographs, all of it projecting an image of a couple who had things under control. But behind those images, a very different reality was playing out. By 2018, it was over, quietly and without warning. And what makes this even more difficult to understand is that their engagement had never been formally announced in the first place, which meant there was nothing official to dissolve. Simply disappeared. And that silence is where the story starts to feel wrong. When something this significant collapses, people usually speak. They defend themselves, they explain themselves, they try to shape how the story is told. Here no one said a word. It was a complete and total shutdown. Then came the development that reframed everything that had come before. Within just months of that breakup, Eduardo was already being seen publicly with Princess Beatrice. Felt rushed. It felt like the timeline did not quite add up. When had that relationship with Beatrice actually begun? Had it started after things ended with Dara, or had it already been forming while the engagement was still technically intact? No one has ever provided a clear answer. But one thing that could not be overlooked was Wolfie, a little boy sitting at the center of all of this, suddenly connected to the British royal family through a relationship his mother had no say in whatsoever. This is where the whole story is rooted. Eduardo did not arrive at the palace with a clean slate. He arrived carrying a broken engagement, an unresolved past, and a child whose life had already been fundamentally altered. But to truly understand how Eduardo became the kind of man capable of leaving one life behind and stepping directly into another, you have to go back to where it all started. Nothing about the way Eduardo handled the years that followed happened by chance. The behavior was not spontaneous. It was something he had been shaped into, gradually and deliberately, from an early age. Those who have studied his life closely tend to point to one year above all others as the turning point, 2011. Whatever happened in that year left a mark on him that time has never fully erased. The Count in the making. In 2011, Eduardo Mapelli Mozzi received news that stopped everything. His stepfather, Christopher Shale, had died. Not quietly, not privately, but at Glastonbury Festival, one of the most high-profile public events in the entire country, surrounded by crowds, cameras, and noise. Making it worse was the fact that just days earlier, Shale's name had already been dragged through the national press after a private political memo he had written was leaked. In it, he had described members of his own party in scathing terms, calling them embarrassing and socially awkward. The story had already spread across every major newspaper in Britain. So when he died, the grief arrived wrapped in public exposure. Christopher Shale had chaired David Cameron's local Conservative association, and his body was discovered in a backstage area that morning. What Eduardo did in the aftermath revealed something important, a pattern that had in many ways been present in his family long before he was born. Eduardo himself was born on November 19, 1983, at the Portland Hospital in London, an institution known for one thing above all else: exclusivity. It was the hospital of choice for the British royal family. Strikingly, it was also the same hospital where Princess Beatrice had been born. Two people who would one day marry had entered the world in the same building, decades before their paths would ever cross. His father, Leandro Mapelli Mozzi, was a man of considerable complexity. Born in Argentina, raised in Italy, and educated in England, he went on to compete in the 1972 Winter Olympics, not for Argentina, not for Italy, but for Great Britain, the country he had adopted rather than been born into. It was an identity that refused to stay fixed in one place, one that moved and adapted and never fully belonged anywhere. Eduardo watched this growing up. And the reinvention did not stop at the Olympics. Leandro went on to become an international art dealer and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, rebuilding his life and succeeding all over again in a completely different arena. That willingness to transform and start over clearly left an impression. His mother, Nikki Williams-Ellis, was equally driven in her own direction. She moved across the worlds of politics, charity, and design, quietly building a life on her own terms. She eventually remarried, and Christopher Shale became Eduardo's stepfather. Eduardo grew up in a household that was blended, layered, built across two different family structures. A stepfather, a half-brother, two worlds existing under a single roof. That same kind of structure would resurface years later in his own life. But there is one element of Eduardo's background that gets mentioned often and explained properly almost never. Title: Eduardo carried the designation of Count of the Kingdom of Italy, inherited through his family line. It had been granted in 1913 by King Victor Emmanuel III to the Mapelli Mozzi family, most likely in recognition of their standing, loyalty, or service to the Italian monarchy at that time, and it had been passed from one generation to the next ever since. On the surface, it sounds like an impressive piece of history. But that same King Victor Emmanuel III later put his signature on Italy's racial laws in 1938, legislation that stripped Italian Jews of their citizenship, their livelihoods, their children's access to education, and their most basic rights as human beings. Did not stop there. Those laws opened a direct path to the deportation of thousands of Italian Jews to Nazi concentration camps, entire families destroyed, entire lives erased. The king responsible for setting all of that in motion is the very same king whose authority gave rise to the title Eduardo carries to this day. Even after Italy formally abolished royal titles in 1946, the family continued to use it. The law had stripped it of any official standing, but they chose to keep it anyway. That choice reveals something. It means the title was never simply a legal designation to them. It was bound up in their sense of identity, their sense of status, their understanding of who they were, even after the country they came from had moved on and left it behind. The same mentality is visible in the family's ancestral estate. The Villa Mapelli Mozzi in northern Italy is not simply a large and impressive property. It is a 15th-century estate that once functioned as a monastery, and it has remained in the family's possession across generations. When Eduardo grew up with a connection to that estate, he was not building something new. He was being absorbed into something ancient, something that predated him entirely and was expected to endure long after him. It reflects a family that does not release its history, its status, or its sense of self, regardless of what the world around it does. Eduardo's education followed the same trajectory. He attended the Dragon School in Oxford, one of the most prestigious preparatory schools in Britain, before moving on to Radley College and eventually completing a master's degree in politics at the University of Edinburgh. Every major door had been opened for him well before he reached adulthood. But none of that education or privilege could have prepared him for the weight of what 2011 brought. Losing Christopher Shale in such a public way, under such intense media scrutiny, at such a raw moment, forced a particular kind of lesson into him at a young age. When your family's name is spread across the national press in the worst possible circumstances, falling apart in public is simply not an option. You learn to project strength. You learn to keep moving. You learn to show a steady face no matter what is happening beneath it. In the wake of that loss, Eduardo channeled his energy outward. He co-founded a charity and cycled through London overnight to raise funds for it. He supported initiatives including the construction of Rwanda's first grass cricket stadium. From the outside, it read as generosity and purpose. But it was also something else entirely. It was a statement, a refusal to be defined by loss or failure, a determination to keep moving forward regardless of the circumstances. With all of that behind him, Eduardo did not drift into adulthood without direction. He entered it with intention, ready to build something of his own. That something was a business he named Bonda. And what he built with it would make him a significant public figure long before Princess Beatrice ever appeared in his story. The empire he built. Bonda property. Real people on the Gold Coast of Australia had placed real money into Eduardo's venture. Savings, not speculation. They had seen the polished promotional imagery for a luxury beachfront development called the Masthead Ocean Club. High-end coastal living backed by credible-sounding names and confident press releases. The coverage had been breathless. The project carried the weight of an international venture with genuine substance behind it. And then everything fell apart. The company behind the Masthead Ocean Club entered administration. The development vanished. And the people who had committed their money were left with nothing except the memory of those glossy images and the very real pain of their losses. While all of this was unfolding, Eduardo Mapelli Mozzi was in Palm Beach, Florida, attending a design conference. That is the side of Bonda property that rarely gets told. Eduardo had founded the company in 2007, at just 23 years old, fresh from university and equipped with a network of family connections that gave him access most young entrepreneurs could only dream of. The model he built the business on was presented as straightforward. Identify undervalued parts of London, develop them into high-end homes, and sell them to the city's wealthiest buyers. Over the course of 2 decades, Bonda oversaw developments with a combined value exceeding £875 million. That is not simply a successful business. That is a machine of considerable scale, built by a man who, despite later disclosing that he is dyslexic, poured everything he had into the visual world of design and luxury property. But this is where the narrative begins to show its cracks. Bonda's entire public reputation rested on that founding claim of targeting undervalued areas of London. Eduardo repeated that story publicly and consistently. Then serious property journalists and Forbes writers began asking uncomfortable questions when one of Bonda's flagship projects appeared in Notting Hill, one of the most expensive and sought-after postcodes in the entire country, a neighborhood that has not been undervalued in decades. And beneath even that inconvenient detail lies something considerably darker. London is in the grip of a severe housing crisis. Thousands of people are being pushed out of the neighborhoods where they grew up because the cost of staying has become impossible. When a company takes properties that are already expensive and drives their value even higher, real people lose their homes and their communities in the process. That is not an unfortunate side effect of Banda's business model. That is the business model. Eduardo met all of this with the same response he brought to every difficult chapter of his life. He kept moving. He kept building. He kept turning up to conferences in well-fitted suits, discussing architecture with total assurance. While real people in Australia were left exposed and without recourse after the collapse, that instinct to project success regardless of what was unraveling behind the scenes had been embedded in him since 2011. The question was always how long it could hold, because what came next had nothing to do with property or business. He was about to meet a woman named Beatrice, and after that, nothing would ever be the same again. How a count wins a princess. 51 days. That is all Beatrice had. From the moment her engagement to Eduardo was publicly announced to the moment everything around it began to collapse, just 51 days had passed. 51 days of what should have been the most joyful stretch of her life. Eduardo and Beatrice had not stumbled across each other by accident. Their families had long moved in the same social circles. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson had known the Mapelli-Mozzi family for years, and Eduardo's mother confirmed as much when the engagement was announced, noting that they had known Beatrice for most of her life. That detail makes what followed feel all the more uncomfortable. Before Eduardo entered her life, Beatrice had spent the better part of a decade in a relationship with a man named Dave Clark. She was 18 when it started and 28 when it ended, 10 years given entirely to a relationship that never produced a proposal and ended without any public explanation. Beatrice never spoke about why. And then, within 2 years, Eduardo was there. But Eduardo was not the clean beginning he may have appeared to be. He had ended his engagement to Dara only in 2018. He had a young son. His past was unresolved and still very present. And yet, by late 2018, something had already begun between them, kept deliberately away from cameras and press. By November of that year, it was clear they were a couple. Then in March 2019, they made their first public appearance together at a fundraising event at the National Portrait Gallery in London. The cameras were everywhere, and there he stood beside a princess, not just any man, but a property developer, a count, and a man carrying a complicated history. People were only beginning to piece it together. The reaction was immediate. Who is he? By May 2019, the question had been answered. They attended Lady Gabriella Windsor's royal wedding side by side, and any remaining doubt was erased. Something serious was happening between them. Then came September 2019 and Eduardo went further than anyone had anticipated. He proposed. He had designed the ring himself, collaborating with British jeweler Sean Lean to bring his vision to life. The finished piece featured a diamond cut into a long rectangular baguette shape, set within a floral pattern along the band. But Sean Lean is not an obvious or gentle choice for such a moment. He built his international reputation through work with the late Alexander McQueen, creating pieces constructed around bones, thorns, coiled spines, and sharp metal. His jewelry was never designed to be comforting or soft. It was designed to unsettle, to disturb, to make whoever encountered it feel something sharp and unsettling. That was the world Lean made his name in. Among his most recognized pieces was one worn by Isabella Blow, the iconic British fashion editor who died by suicide in 2007. The man Eduardo chose to create the ring for the most significant moment of Beatrice's life had built his entire reputation inside a world where beauty and tragedy were inseparable. On September 26, 2019, Buckingham Palace made it official. Princess Beatrice of York was engaged to Eduardo Mapelli-Mozzi. The statement released was brief, polished, almost clinical, carefully chosen words about building a life together, smooth enough on the surface to reveal nothing of what lay underneath. And there was a reason for that careful control, one the public had not yet been told about. Not everyone within the royal family had greeted the news with celebration. Reports surfaced repeatedly in royal coverage that King Charles, then still Prince Charles, had harbored serious reservations about the engagement from the beginning. Things had moved very fast. But the announcement went ahead regardless, and the countdown began. In those weeks, Beatrice would have been immersed in the planning, the dress, the venue, the guest list, the shape of the future she had finally been allowed to imagine. For once, things appeared to be working. For once, stability seemed within reach. And then November 16, 2019 arrived. That was the day Prince Andrew sat down for a BBC interview. What followed was a collapse of extraordinary speed and severity. Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein was already a matter of public record, but the interview transformed it into something far worse. His answers, his demeanor, the specific things he chose to say, all of it sent shockwaves through the country. Epstein had been an American financier convicted in 2008 of soliciting prostitution from a minor. He was then arrested again in 2019 on federal charges involving the trafficking of dozens of underage girls. Andrew had maintained his friendship with Epstein for years, even after that first conviction. Faced with public demand for answers, Andrew decided to give them on live television. He told the interviewer that he had absolutely no memory of ever meeting his accuser, Virginia Giuffre, a woman who had publicly stated that Epstein had trafficked her to Andrew when she was 17 years old. He said he had no recollection of the specific evening she had described. He expressed no regret about his continued friendship with Epstein, stating that it had provided him, in his own words, with some seriously beneficial business connections. And then he said something that stopped the world. Virginia Giuffre had described Andrew as sweating heavily on the night in question. Andrew stared directly into the camera and explained that this was simply not possible. He had developed a medical condition in the aftermath of the Falklands War, he said, a condition that made it physically impossible for him to sweat. The public did not know quite how to respond to that. Within hours, the answer was both horror and disbelief in equal measure. Every major news channel dissected the interview. People were outraged that he had shown no awareness of, and no concern for, the suffering of Epstein's victims. The fallout was so severe that within 48 hours, Andrew released a statement announcing his withdrawal from public duties with the Queen's permission. An entire public life, dismantled in 2 days. Beatrice's engagement was barely weeks old when her world changed completely. Her father had become, almost overnight, the most criticized man in Britain. Everything around her shifted. And this is where the real tension breaks open, because Eduardo had proposed into a world that appeared structured, controlled, and stable. What they woke up in was something else entirely, a world defined by scandal, public fury, and pressure with no clear end in sight. There was no path back. And before either of them had time to absorb the scale of what had happened, more was coming, and it would land even harder than what had come before. The wedding the world almost missed. The wedding began falling apart before it ever had a chance to take shape. The first blow came from an old photograph that suddenly resurfaced and refused to disappear. It showed Prince Andrew with his arm around Virginia Giuffre inside Ghislaine Maxwell's home. And because Virginia had publicly accused Andrew of participating in her abuse as part of Epstein's trafficking network, the image was now being treated as potential evidence. Every time it circulated, it landed directly on Beatrice's wedding. Eduardo stood inside that storm alongside her. Consider what that meant for a man who had spent his entire adult life managing his public image with extraordinary care. He was preparing to marry into a family whose most visible crisis was playing out in real time, in public, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Then the second blow came when COVID-19 brought the entire world to a standstill. The wedding plans could not survive it. The chapel royal ceremony was postponed indefinitely. The reception at Buckingham Palace was cancelled outright. Everything they had planned was gone. What remained was a scaled-down alternative that bore almost no resemblance to what they had originally envisioned. On July 17, 2020, they were married at the Royal Chapel of All Saints at Royal Lodge in Windsor. The ceremony was small, immediate family only, and carried the feeling of something that had been deliberately kept out of sight. Yet inside all of that difficulty, something unexpected happened. Queen Elizabeth II made a quiet but profound decision. She did not simply offer Beatrice something to borrow for the day. She went into the most personal part of her own history and brought out two of her most treasured possessions: a vintage ivory silk taffeta gown originally designed by Norman Hartnell in 1962, which the Queen herself had worn to the world premiere of Lawrence of Arabia, and her diamond-fringed tiara, the very tiara she had worn on her own wedding day in 1947. This was an elderly woman watching her granddaughter's wedding be stripped of nearly everything by circumstances neither of them had any power over. She could not undo the scandal. She could not restore what had been lost. But she could reach back into the deepest part of her own life and wrap it around Beatrice's shoulders and place it on her head, saying without a single spoken word that this day still mattered, and that Beatrice still mattered. Eduardo stood there and witnessed all of it, the stark contrast between what this wedding should have been and what it had become. Then came the moment that sat most uncomfortably of all. Inside that small private chapel, Prince Andrew walked his daughter toward the man she had chosen. Whatever he had done, whatever the world had concluded about him, he was still her father, and she had still wanted him there. But when the official wedding photographs were released, he was absent from every single one. Not one image. That absence was entirely deliberate. If Andrew appeared in those photographs, the story of the day would no longer be about Beatrice. It would become about him. So he was removed from the visual record. Eduardo was aware of all of this, and he said nothing. He has always said nothing. And that silence is itself revealing, because it points to something consistent in his character. He does not confront. He does not push back. He absorbs and he moves on. Which raises a question that many people had begun to ask. What exactly is a man like this truly capable of? Beatrice would have to discover the answer to that herself. The wedding was behind them. But what lay ahead was not peace. It was something far more complicated, and it announced itself with the arrival of their first child. Royal life, blended family, and the babies. The first night did not go the way anyone had prepared for. There was fear in that room. There were tears. There were machines and doctors moving with quiet urgency, voices low but clipped. Beatrice lay there with no control over any of it. That was January 22, 2025. Their daughter, Athena Elizabeth Rose Mapelli-Mozzi, arrived several weeks ahead of schedule at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. And that moment said everything about what their life had quietly become, because from the outside it still looked composed and intact, while underneath it the pressure had never really stopped. After the wedding, the pace of change never slowed. They moved first into a 4-bedroom apartment within St. James's Palace. That phrasing sounds straightforward until you sit with what it actually means. To live inside a palace is to live there on the institution's terms, not your own. And this was the same institution that had already begun pulling away from her father in very public and deliberate ways. They were inside it, but they were not fully sheltered by it. That was the reality of their position. Beatrice and Eduardo were not working members of the royal family, but they remained visible enough to attract a steady and unrelenting level of public attention. That creates a deeply uncomfortable in-between space, seen but not fully supported, connected but not fully included. Both of them had to learn to live inside that ambiguity. Beatrice continued working throughout. She held a senior position at a technology company called Affinity, serving as vice president of strategic partnerships. On the surface it projected normalcy, a royal maintaining a professional life outside the institution. Then something difficult emerged. In 2021, the New York Times published a thorough and detailed investigation into Affinity's founder, Zia Chishti. The investigation laid out credible allegations of sexual harassment and assault made by multiple women against him. Chishti stepped down from the company in the wake of that reporting. Beatrice remained. She issued no public statement, offered no visible separation from a company whose founder had just been credibly accused of serious misconduct against women by one of the world's most respected news organizations. Eduardo said nothing publicly either. Once again, silence closed around something that demanded acknowledgement. Then another shift arrived in late 2022. They left the palace. They relocated to a 6-bedroom converted farmhouse in the Cotswolds, complete with tennis courts, extensive gardens, an outdoor pool, and a reported value of around £3.5 million. It was framed publicly as a lifestyle decision. It was not. Queen Elizabeth II had died in September 2022. We're interrupting our programs to inform you that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has died. The move out of the palace followed almost immediately. The Queen had been a quiet but enormously consequential source of protection for Beatrice and her family within the institution. She was the one figure whose love for them was unconditional, and whose authority within the royal family was beyond question. When she died, that protection went with her. The decision to leave the palace came in the direct aftermath of losing the one person who had consistently shielded them from the worst of what surrounded their family. This was not a couple choosing a country lifestyle. This was a couple regrouping after losing the most powerful ally they had. By that point, they already had one child together. Princess Beatrice and her husband Edoardo Mapelli have welcomed their first child, a baby girl. Sienna Elizabeth Mapelli Mozzi, born in September 2021, a child already placed within the line of succession, a life already being shaped by rules and expectations that neither of her parents had full control over. And Wolfie was still present throughout all of it, moving between two very different worlds. His mother's private life on one side and his father's royal adjacency on the other. Then came the announcement of a second pregnancy in October 2024. Behind the public smiles, the weight was building again, because this was not simply another milestone. It was happening inside a life that was already stretched in multiple directions at once. Princess Beatrice is expecting her second child with her husband, Mr. Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi, a family that has never fully escaped scrutiny. And then, as if everything else were not already enough, the premature birth shattered whatever remained of the composed exterior. Beatrice later spoke about Athena's early arrival in terms that left no room for understatement. "Shook me completely," she said. "It was a deeply, deeply horrifying experience." The impact was lasting enough that she took on a new patronage with Born, a charity working globally to end premature birth. She wanted the terror of what she had lived through to become something meaningful. Edoardo was beside her through every part of it, steady, present, and completely unreadable. No outbursts, no public explanations, no visible fractures. Many who observed this found it unsettling rather than reassuring. They believe that kind of composure is not innate. It is constructed. Which brings everything back to the central question. What kind of man passes through this volume and this variety of pressure without ever visibly breaking? Because the more carefully you look, the clearer it becomes that Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi's silence is not the absence of something. It is a deliberate presence. And the truth it points toward had been circling this family for years before it finally surfaced. The Epstein shadow. In 2025, the United States Department of Justice released a new body of documents connected to the Jeffrey Epstein case. Breaking tonight, the Justice Department releasing more than 3 million pages of documents related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Beatrice's name appeared in those documents, not as someone accused of wrongdoing, but her name was there, tied to a telephone call that had taken place in 2011, a call that involved her mother, Sarah Ferguson, and a man named Jody Mears. Sarah Ferguson is not simply Beatrice's mother. She is a woman who has spent years at the center of serious controversy, entangled in financial scandals, publicly questioned over her judgment, and connected in unresolved ways to the Epstein world through her long relationship with Andrew. Yet more damaging allegations about the former Prince Andrew and his relationship with convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Jody Mears was not a conventional journalist. He was someone Ferguson had used to place favorable coverage of herself in the press. The phone call was connected to something specific. Ferguson was reportedly attempting to solicit £500,000 from a contact who had financial links to Epstein. Mears was serving as the intermediary, and Beatrice was on that call. She was 23 years old at the time. What she understood about the true nature of that conversation has never been addressed in any public forum. What she knew about who those contacts were, and where that money was expected to come from, has never been explained. Those questions have never been put to her directly in any sustained or serious way. But the documents put them on the record, and the world took notice. Now consider what Eduardo was doing while all of this was unfolding. He was attending a private lunch at Cornice, a Michelin-starred restaurant in Belgravia. Photographs circulated on social media from what appeared to be a professional networking event. He looked relaxed, present, entirely undisturbed. People were enraged. His wife's name had just appeared in federal documents connected to a trafficking investigation, and he was at lunch. He has not made a single public statement about any of it, not about Andrew, not about the documents, not about Beatrice's name appearing in them. The silence has been total, unbroken, and sustained. That silence serves a purpose. Protects him. It protects the image and the access and everything he has spent his life constructing. And that is the detail that cannot be comfortably set aside. That is where the critics have landed. Over time, a pattern became impossible to ignore. In the beginning it looked like composure, a man holding himself together while the world around him burned. But the same response kept appearing, situation after situation, crisis after crisis, always the same stillness, always the same silence. And that is when people began naming it for what it actually is. A calculated pattern of self-preservation. A man who never steps into the fire, never absorbs the blow himself, never places himself between his family and the damage being done to them. Instead, he remains untouched while those around him take the impact. That is the behavior that stayed hidden for so long, not because it was invisible, but because it took time to connect the moments into a pattern. Now the pattern is clear, and it changes how everything looks. Because the question is no longer what has already happened. The question is what comes next. When the moment arrives, as it will, when his family genuinely needs him to stand up, to speak out, to put something of himself at risk for their sake, what will he do? Will he finally step forward? Or will the silence hold, as it always has? He has built a successful business. He has built access to power. He has built a life that functions extremely well, at least on the surface. But silence, however controlled and disciplined it may be, ultimately serves one person above all others. And after everything that has come to light, one thing remains deeply and persistently unsettling. A man this visible, this close to power, and this embedded in one of the most scrutinized families on earth, and still no one can clearly articulate what he actually stands for. That is not an oversight. That is not an accident. That is a choice.